All right, so this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 24, Land Empires in the Age of Imperialism, 1800 to 1870. We'll be looking at Section 1, the Ottoman Empire. So this term, imperialism, I don't think we really had the chance to take a look at it, but it's more or less used to describe a period in world history where industrial nations essentially, quote-unquote, take over non-industrial nations. And so this chapter is about, what about those land empires in which we talked about in previous chapters? How do they compete with these newly industrial powers and their effort to kind of take over everywhere else? We really are looking at mainly here the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, which is, of course, what we'll look at in this section. The Russian Empire, which we'll look at next section. And the Qing Empire in China, to kind of get an idea. For the most part, both the Ottomans and the Russians try some sort of reform. That is to recognize that some changes need to take place. Not all of those reforms really work out, but there is an effort to change. Whereas the Qing Empire, for the most part, is a story of resistance. That is to resist a lot of the changes being brought about by the outside world. So let's take a look at the Ottoman Empire. Recall, the Ottoman Empire is the empire in the Middle East. It is primarily where modern-day Turkey is. Controlling important areas like the Balkans in Eastern Europe, Northern Africa, modern-day Iraq, a lot of Middle Eastern countries today, so like Syria, Israel, all of those nations kind of fall within the Ottomans' borders. However, between these years, 1800 and 1870, the Ottoman Empire was sometimes called the sick man of Europe. And that was because, really since the 1600s, or for about 200 years, the Ottoman Empire had been losing its influence and losing its kind of prestige in a lot of ways. Some examples include Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Both of these nations exerted greater independence. So we might say let's clear up a few things first. The Mamluks, those were people in Egypt. So they were people in Egypt. They had ruled Egypt prior to Ottoman control. They reasserted their control. And the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, these are Islamic holy cities. In Saudi Arabia, or what would become Saudi Arabia, or the Arabian Peninsula, local rulers there denied the ability for the Sultan to go to these cities. So this was kind of a slap in the face, you might say, to the Ottoman Sultan. Again, the Ottoman Sultan is pretty much the Ottoman Emperor, we can think of him as, right? Simply referred to as a Sultan. So in both of these examples, you have regions maybe breaking away. And the fact that the Ottomans continue to lose territory and continue to lose influence in parts of their empire to groups like the Mamluks is more evidence of this trope right here, this idea that the Ottoman Empire is like a sick man who's just slowly dying. However, though, the interactions with the outside world, namely that with the newly industrialized nations of Europe. Now, recall that we talked about the dual revolutions that occurred in Europe, one being industrial, which had a lot to do with the economy, right? The way that goods were produced and distributed. But we also talked about the political. And the political revolutions are very influential in terms of their ideas that they had. And those ideas will penetrate in not only the Ottoman Empire, but really all around the world. And so it's how to contend now with kind of these, this new economic system, the factory system, and how to contend with these new political ideas. So some of these ideas were first introduced in 1798 when Napoleon invaded Egypt. So the French invasion of 1798, this was a French invasion of Egypt. This was during the French Revolutionary Wars. Of course, the greatest adversary for France was Britain at the time. And in fact, the British successfully forced the French out of Egypt. But when France invaded, what it did was that it brought these ideas, right? It brought these two ideas to Egypt. And so in the aftermath of French retreat, Muhammad Ali of Egypt, the ruler of Egypt, began to what we call a system of modernization. And modernization, again, just means to embrace kind of new ideas. You can think of modernization maybe as being like the opposite of tradition, looking more towards the future, new ideas. Some examples of the way that Egypt modernized in the aftermath of this was to create the first newspaper in the Islamic world. So we might say Egypt published the first newspaper. And we'll just say the Muslim world. However, though, Muhammad Ali would find himself on the wrong side of a British and Ottoman war, and as a result of being defeated by a combined force of British and Ottoman troops, this really kind of halted, or at least interrupted, modernization. So at least in the case of Egypt, there was an attempt to try and embrace these ideas a little bit more strongly, but in the end, Muhammad Ali was not successful as maybe he would like to have been in the long run. For the Ottoman Empire, though, again, kind of the same story. The Sultan at the time, Sultan Selim, wanted to, again, we're going to use this term modernize. Again, that is to kind of embrace the new technology from the Industrial Revolution, embrace some of these new political ideas, especially when it comes to the way that governments are run. We'll talk a little bit more about the specific kind of reforms that take place. But Sultan Selim ran into resistance from the two groups in the Ottoman Empire, which had incredible amounts of power and really didn't want to see things changed. The first one was the Janissaries. Remember, the Janissaries are more or less like the personal army of the Sultan. But as the years went on, right, the Janissaries, or pretty much the Ottoman military, continued to break apart from the Sultan. That is, they exercise political independence. And one of the big reforms, right, one of the big reforms was the army, right? You can think about different ways in which armies had changed. Technology was a big one, right? The use of guns as opposed to cavalry, which was the more traditional way of doing things. There was also in Europe at the time military schools, which had studied tactics and everything related to warfare. That was new, right? That was not traditional. And so the Janissaries saw efforts to modernize, right? To sort of put together an army in a different way, in a new way, in a modern way, saw that as a threat. And the Sultan and the Janissaries would continue to have to kind of keep an eye on one another. Even though technically the Janissaries should have been the army of the Sultan, they really sort of, ran things independently. An example of this is what happened in Serbia. Serbian nationalism. So recall, nationalism is one of these ideas that was a consequence of the political revolutions. We'll talk a lot more about nationalism and how it's significant. But the Janissaries essentially exercise independent control in Serbia, doing whatever they want against the Sultan's orders. Violence between the predominantly Muslim Janissaries and the Orthodox Christianity Serbian population there led to violence and strife, ultimately resulting in a call for independence. Serbians, recall, in terms of nationalism, we want to think about the way that people identify themselves in terms of culture, language, religion. Language is a big indicator. So the Serbians were primarily Orthodox Christians. who wrote in Greek, could speak a number of different languages. And the Janissaries and the Ottoman Empire, again, was primarily an Islamic empire and wrote in Arabic in most cases, right? So Serbian nationalism, that is trying to unite everybody who is Orthodox, everybody who is Christian, everybody who uses the Greek alphabet as a way of writing, to unify that population against the primarily Islamic and Arabic Ottoman Empire. And again, some of that violence occurring as a result of the Janissaries more or less acting independently in that area. Another big, I would say, obstacle for Sultan Selim and other Ottoman reformers was the religious clerics and the scholars, sometimes called the ulama. So the ulama are the religious leaders, right? They're like the church leaders. And one thing that differentiates Islam from Christianity is that there is no like pope, for example, right? There's a position called the caliph, but it's not universally recognized, whereas in the Catholic world, the pope is kind of recognized as the leader. So you have a lot of religious leaders, and most of them are local. And what religious leaders and scholars have pretty much a monopoly on is the law code and education. And again, one of the things that is about modernization is to make the law code modern and to make education modern. And again, because the Sultan wants to change these things, it is a threat to the clerics and the scholars. And for that, Sultan Selim was ultimately not successful. He was executed more or less as a result of his efforts to try and reform. So at least in the case of Selim III, it would be, it's definitely telling that any effort by the Sultan, who again is the equivalent to the emperor, but whose power has been significantly undermined, it's going to be difficult for them to enact any sort of reforms. Sultans that came afterwards did take opportunities to kind of diminish the power of their threats. So, for example, when Greece declared independence in 1830 from the Ottoman Empire, so this was another piece of territory the Ottomans lost, the Sultan used that as a way to ultimately dissolve the Janissary Corps and thus eliminating a big threat in order to enact various reforms. And again, the Janissaries being the, essentially the army, they had failed in maintaining Greek independence. The Sultan used that as an opportunity to dissolve the Janissary Corps. And so with that, further reforms could be pursued. And probably the most significant reforms are that of the Tanzimat reforms. So again, Tanzimat is just a term used to describe some of those individuals who wanted to push forward with these reforms, including some of the sultans. The reforms included reforms to the law, army, and taxes. So what we mean by this is kind of maybe a more secular law. Secular means non-religious. A modern army. Not an army of Janissaries, because they're gone, but an army in which anyone can serve. Right? Conscription. Not a protected class like the Janissaries were. And a modern tax code, right? A more efficient and central tax code. I might say central tax system. Now, in trying to push these reforms, there was pushback from a lot of local leaders because, of course, the predominant law system in the Ottoman Empire at the time was Sharia law, which is Islamic law, right? Religious law. And so there's a contention here between the effort to try and put a secular law code forward and Islamic law. But it was somewhat successful. More or less secular law, or the Tanzimat laws, applied to kind of, maybe more kind of like larger, maybe court cases. I don't know if larger is a good example. But Islamic law pretty much maintained its influence in terms of like family and community. So especially when it came to things like marriage and divorce, Sharia law reigned supreme. But when it came to other legal issues, secular law could kind of fill in the blank there. So it's not that one really canceled out the other. They certainly have a sort of uneasy tension between the two, but they coexisted within the Ottoman Empire. And some of these Tanzimat forms were very successful. So, for example, Istanbul University was established as one of the first kind of modern schools inside the Ottoman Empire. The establishment of the first newspaper in the Ottoman Empire as well, following the example from Egypt. The modernization of the Ottoman army, you can see some of the pictures here, dressing up in European uniforms, using modern rifles. And a big part of this was the fact that there was conscription, right? Anybody and everybody should be able to serve inside of the military. And this was especially true when it came to religious minorities. So for a very long time, religious minorities, non-Muslims, were not allowed to serve in the military, but they, in replace of that, they paid a tax. And so one of the things that the Tanzimat reforms did was it created kind of greater religious equality before the law, right? So before, what the rule was in the Ottoman Empire was that if you were not Muslim, if you were a Christian or a Jew, you had to pay an extra tax. But that tax was repealed as a part of these Tanzimat reforms. A lot of the issues regarding secular law also put the idea of equality before the law. That is to create a law code in which Muslims and non-Muslims are treated as equals. And again, that might put some pressure or some tension between this idea of Sharia law. But at the same time, even though the Tanzimat reforms were bringing in a lot of outside ideas, from Europe especially, there were some parts of Ottoman culture and tradition that remained. Sharia law is a great example of a part of Ottoman tradition that really remains, but also the fez. The fez is the hat Ottoman troops wore. And you can actually see it in this picture here, the little red hat on the top. And what made it different from their European counterparts was that, a European hat would have some sort of like bill attached to it that would block out the sun. However, though, for the Ottomans to properly pray, the bill got in the way from their head hitting the ground. And so by removing the bill, that was thus the fez. And so that was kind of an interesting difference between the way that some of the uniforms were for Ottoman armies as compared to European armies. So you see kind of this blending of, again, kind of new European ideas, but at the same time, Ottoman tradition. For the most part, the Tanzimat reforms, in terms of its impact on women, was that for the most part it diminished opportunities. Recall that the political revolutions in Europe did not significantly grant women any sort of political rights or the right to vote or anything along those lines. Prior to the, those ideas about women's suffrage will come a little bit later. But remember, prior to the Tanzimat reforms in the early Ottoman period, at the very least, there were the palace women, and those were the women closest to the Sultan, who could exercise some power over the Sultan. The Sultan was always, typically male. There were times, the Sultan was always male, but there were times where the Sultan was so young where the Sultan's mother or perhaps the Sultan's wife could possibly rule for a short time period. The Sultan was also surrounded by a lot of women in the palace who could persuade him to do certain things and to exercise power. So with this kind of more modern democratic system that explicitly excludes women, or at least the idea of moving more towards democracy, the Sultan certainly still has a lot of power and influence. Women see some of their opportunities diminished as a consequence of efforts to reform. Now, one major conflict that involves the Ottoman Empire is the Crimean War. And I would say that the Crimean War only accelerates kind of Ottoman modernization. Catherine the Great, she was the ruler of Russia. And at the time, geopolitically, the Eastern question was something that concerned not just the Ottoman Empire, but also the major powers of the world like Britain and France. The Eastern question is the question of who controls former Ottoman territory. Territory. And of course, it's, will it be Russia? Will it be Britain? Will it be France? Right? France tried to take over Egypt. They failed. Or will it actually be the Ottomans themselves? Right? And of course, this is coming at a time when all of Europe recognizes the Ottoman Empire as, again, this idea here, the sick man of Europe, and the Ottomans are just losing territory by the day. Saudi Arabia is breaking away. Egypt broke away. The Serbians are on the verge of breaking away. Greece broke away. So, from the perspective of outsiders, the Russians, the British, the French, they see the Ottomans as, kind of falling apart, so to speak. And the question is, well, who's going to control that territory? Now, the Russians, of course, hoped that it would be them. And that was ultimately what led to the Crimean War, which was a conflict between Russia versus Britain, France, and the Ottomans. Right, so those are the two sides that are fighting. Of course, the British and the French believe that the Russians are the biggest threat. Now, recall at this particular time period, we're talking about, I think, roughly the 1850s, that this is coming off of the back of Russia's defeat of Napoleon, where Napoleon essentially had successfully conquered pretty much everything in Europe. It was the Russians who were powerful enough to stand up to him and defeat him. And so the Russians are seen as kind of the biggest threat in Europe, especially in the post-Napoleonic era. In terms of who wins this war, it is the British, the French, and the Ottoman side. So ultimately, the Russians are defeated. Their effort to try to scoop up former Ottoman territory is temporarily thwarted. But one thing interesting about the Crimean War is that these nations get kind of a sneak peek at modern warfare. And that more or less is, guns, but more specifically rifles. Guns and rifles had been, or at least guns had been along for quite some time. Rifles are relatively new. But they'd been sort of technologically limited, so they weren't as effective. By the Crimean War, guns and rifles are proving their worth over, typical traditional military units, and that is the cavalry. Cavalry are horses, so horses are becoming more obsolete. Rifles, because of their reload speed, how fast and how quickly they can reload and how much more accurate they are by the 1850s, are kind of quickly gaining ground there. Now, in the aftermath of the Crimean War, even though the Ottomans were on the winning side, Britain and France thus had a lot of influence in the Ottoman Empire. So a lot more European commerce, the ability for Europeans to do business in the Ottoman Empire. And this kind of led to a certain economic imperialism. That is, even though the Ottomans existed politically, that in the aftermath of the Crimean War, the British and the French really could take advantage of the Ottoman Empire economically, right? So if we scroll up, if we think about imperialism as being when industrial nations, quote unquote, take over non-industrial nations, well, economically speaking, for the most part, the British and the French are going to economically take over the Ottoman Empire. Banks and insurance are created in the Ottoman Empire. These were things that existed in Europe prior to this. Foreign loans. This will create a huge Ottoman debt to countries like Britain and France. So the Ottomans are constantly having to pay the British and the French money. Tariffs, low tariffs on European goods. This more or less allows for the British and the French to sell their goods in the Ottoman Empire for a very cheap price, because the British and the French are mostly industrial. The quality of their goods are better, the prices of their goods are better, and what this does is that this destroys local business. So Ottoman businesses are getting crushed, and it doesn't allow for an industrial Ottoman Empire to flourish. There are still some things that economically make money in the Ottoman Empire, things like coffee and tobacco and opium, stuff like that. But for the most part, when it comes to manufactured goods, because of low tariffs, Europeans are getting the benefit of the doubt. And lastly, extraterritoriality, which is separate laws for Europeans. So in other words, if you're a European, a British or French person that lives in the Ottoman Empire, you're not actually subject to their laws. You're subject to a different set of laws that give you a little bit more freedom. And again, this was done in a way to not maybe upset the British and the French, who again had exercised at this point a lot of economic influence in the Ottoman Empire. There was a group of Ottomans who combined reform and nationalism. Certainly a sense of like Turkish and Islamic. That is to say, this is a group of people in the Ottoman Empire that don't like the fact that the British and the French speak a different language, different religion, bring a different culture with them. I mean, they're different nationalities. And so by trying to combine an effort to reform, that is to make the Ottoman Empire stronger, with a sense of nationalism, that is, build the Ottoman empires for Ottomans, whatever an Ottoman is, right? It's not French and it's not British. A lot of it has to do with the Turkish language, but maybe not exclusively. A lot of it has to do with religion. You have to be a Muslim, but maybe not exclusively. And the Young Turks, or sometimes called the Young Ottomans, because there's a group that comes after that's also called the Young Turks, so it's a little bit confusing there, did create a constitution in 1876, which set up a parliamentary government, kind of a more modern system to mimic and copy what other countries were doing. But 1 year later, 1877, it was suspended. And the tradition continued. The rule of the Sultan, there would be no parliament, there would be no democratic change, and for the most part, European countries would continue to exploit the Ottoman Empire. So here we can kind of get a little bit of an idea of where we're talking about in terms of the map here. We see the Ottomans in this particular region. In fact, this is showing you in all of the green, is showing you the extent to which the Ottoman Empire existed in 1830, right? So this was a lot of territory that the Ottomans had controlled in this particular region, right? All this here. In the green and yellow, that is everything the Ottomans lost, right? So by the time we get to 1900, this is only what exists, right? All of this has been lost. And of course, the question of all this territory, this is what we mean by the Eastern question. Who is going to pick up all of this land when the Ottomans continue to retreat for their inability to, administer or rule it?